I'm super, super excited about our first speakers for tonight, Stefanie Posavec and Miriam Quick. Some of you might be already familiar with Stefanie and Miriam's previous work. You might have heard about the Dear Data project that Stefanie did with Georgia Lupi, or some of Miriam's data journalism stories for the BBC. But they are here to talk about their new book, which is apparently also a portal to the universe. I'll let Stefanie and Miriam explain. Over to you, both of you.
Thanks, Robin. Thanks for the introduction. And thank you from us for inviting us to speak at Hacks and Hackers. Sad it couldn't be in person, but we're really happy to be here tonight. So I'm Miriam. I'm a data journalist who also works with data artists. Many of my projects combine data and music.
Miriam, you are on rehearsal mode. You need to go to share screen.
Oh dear.
Okay.
I'm sorry about that. I'll start again. So it says I'm screen sharing. Can you all see a mountain background?
No, we see your notes.
Okay. Let me try and sort that out.
All right. I think we've just shown to everyone that we use notes.
We totally practiced this earlier, you know. Let me see if I can get this right. Desktop 2. I'm going to start again. Can everyone see the right screen now?
Yes, it's wonderful.
Thank you, Stefanie.
No problem.
I'll start again. So I'm Miriam. I'm a data journalist, also works with data artists. Many of my projects combine data and music, such as Oddity Viz. This was a collaboration with information designer Valentina De Filippo that visualizes musical data from David Bowie's song Space Oddity on a series of 10 engraved records with accompanying posters and animation. At the moment, I'm working with data journalist Duncan Gear on a new data sonification podcast called Loud Numbers. Each episode will take a different data set and turn it into a piece of music. The podcast should be available at the end of this year, fingers crossed.
And I am Stefanie, an information designer, artist, and author. A project of mine, some of you might have heard of, is Dear Data, a year-long project with Georgia Lupi, where every week we collected our personal data and drew it on a postcard to send to the other. And this culminated in a book and journal, and then the postcards from the project are held in the permanent collection at MoMA. And at the moment, I'm an artist in residence with people like you, a research group exploring data personalization, and my focus is personalized medicine. And through my art practice, I'm researching how people who work with the biobanks, big data, perceive the people behind the numbers who consent to their biological samples being used and stored in this way. As for me and Miriam, I guess you could say we are friends who drink together and also do data together. We've known each other for about a decade now and first started working together professionally around 2012 on data visualization and information graphic projects. And since then, our collaborations have moved towards art commissions, museum installations, and publishing books together.
Our practice is physical, playful, often multisensory, and often accessible to all ages. It includes projects like this one that are touchable and wearable. This is called Air Transformed, and it was an art commission where we explored physical ways of communicating open air quality data from Sheffield in a memorable and experiential way. So one part of the project presented 3 weeks of data on PM10 levels as necklaces that you could touch and wear. And the other part communicated 3 days of pollution in Sheffield through these glasses that would make your vision more or less hazy depending on the air quality that day. Or our work can be more straightforward and informative, like this information graphic, which is called Vaccine Confidence Cascade, and it's now a permanent part of the Wellcome collection in London. It imagines the thought processes of parents who must decide whether to allow their children to be vaccinated against HPV in the face of conflicting information and media scare stories.
We've also worked together at the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, where for 6 months last year, I was the artist in residence. Miriam collaborated with me on the data collection, where we collected a mixture of basic demographic and personality data from visitors. And then I worked with this data to create playful ship's badges, referencing the coats of arms you see on Royal Navy ships in order to commemorate the visitor fleet of families, tourists, and school children that floated through the museum.
This project is called Sleep Songs, and in this project we measured our own breathing rate, along with our husbands, over a night's sleep, and we transformed the data into two different artworks. Stefanie created the visual artwork on the left, and I wrote two pieces of music based on the data for choir. Each 5-minute song represents a night of breathing for a different couple. Most importantly, we have a new book out. I'm a Portal to the Universe was published this month in the UK by Particular Books, who are a Penguin imprint. And so today we'll be sharing a little bit more about this book, along with the creative process that we used to make it. That process actually started with a meeting in a cafe in South London in the summer of 2018, when we were both feeling bored. We were bored with charts, we were bored with infographics, we were bored even with these beautifully designed interactive data viz websites. We were suffering from chart fatigue. But where did this chart fatigue come from?
Well, I'll start from a designer's perspective. Well, working with data inherently places limitations on its visual output, which makes sense because the data must shape its form. However, it can be tiring as a designer to pull the same underlying design structures off the peg and use them over and over within your design solution. As someone from a communication design background, this feels counterintuitive to me, as in my field of design, the central goal is to continually develop new visual and conceptual approaches. Of course, you can develop new aesthetic representations of data, but it can still feel like a Sisyphean task, as again, there are natural forms that the data will tend to take. I was also once a book cover designer, where the goal is to quickly communicate a book's concept in a clever and visually arresting way. But when working with data, I really miss this ability to create these visual concepts that go beyond just using carrots to represent carrot data or emojis to represent emoji data, but have wittiness and playfulness at their core, and they create, as Beryl McAlhone or David Stewart might call it, a smile in the mind. And for me, I find that wit and humor in data visualization is often driven by the data journalist or researcher as opposed to the designer, who again is inherently constrained by the data.
From my perspective as a data journalist, I love charts, obviously, and I make them all the time. But there's a big but. Because charts can seem to encapsulate everything about a topic, they can make it seem like that's all that there is to know about it. And they can also introduce a degree of what you might call distance from what they represent. For example, this chart shows the number of endangered species is rising, and sadly this is true. But on further investigation, the chart only includes just over 100,000 species assessed by the IUCN, a tiny fraction of the millions or perhaps billions of species out there. The truth is, we don't actually know how many species are living on this planet. Yes, this is an argument for reading the small print, but more fundamentally, it points to the fact that reality is always more complex than any one chart. So I started thinking about how you might communicate data without charts in a more direct and less abstract way.
Our chart fatigue meant we also grew weary of well-worn formats such as the infographic book, an innovative format a decade ago that's completely transformed the data design landscape, and one we've both worked on in the past, but it's long since been superseded by online graphics. But we still love books, so we asked ourselves, how can we make something different than the standard info book? With all of this in mind, we began to brainstorm new ideas for collaboration while dancing my baby to sleep in a cafe, so I was on mat leave at the time, and we came up with our super book idea. What if we made a book where the book itself is the measuring device? So we began to develop the general concept. The book itself was a measuring device that could be used to measure things. So our working title was The Measuring Book. And it's a book for almost everyone, from children aged 8 and up to adults. Our goal was also to write for the data uninitiated or data intimidated, people who wouldn't normally pick up a book with data or science in its title. We wanted the book to be accessible enough for children, but entertaining enough for adults with a bit of bite and humor to it. And finally, our golden rule and biggest constraint. All the data should be represented on a 1-to-1 scale, printed on the page at actual size.
So over time, our narrative vision emerged. We realised that the book should speak directly to the reader in the first person and have a strong personality. We kind of characterise it as fun, playful, and sometimes a little arrogant. So the book tells you stories about a universe that is dynamic, constantly moving and changing, in which everything is connected to everything else, full of millions or billions of living organisms and countless mysterious, elusive things flying through us or away from us. For example, this spread, which estimates that based on the book's volume, there were probably about 187,000 relic neutrinos passing through it at any one time. And in case you don't know, relic neutrinos are subatomic particles left over from the first moments after the Big Bang, and they're very, very hard to detect. By being a measuring device, the book is like a portal to the world around you, through which you can see things which were previously invisible. So it's a scientific book, but it is also a story for children and for adults. In this spread, the book flies to the moon, where it gathers a blanket of moon dust as thick as one of its own pages. In reality, this would take around 200 years. I calculated this number based on measurements of moon dust deposition over time taken on lunar missions, and Stefanie sampled the grey colour of the moon from a photo of its surface. But there's magic too. After all, a talking book is flying to the moon. We settled for a balance between fact and fantasy in this book that we decided to call data-driven magic realism. All the numbers are as accurate as I could get them, and often based on peer-reviewed research. But the book is also full of thought experiments and what ifs. So what if there were air in space, or a book could talk? And it goes off on these flights of fantasy about what would happen if it were made of water or plutonium, or if it were orbiting the Earth covered in solar panels. So our goal was to make scientific ideas accessible and approachable for readers of all ages. We tried to include facts and concepts that weren't common knowledge already, but that anyone could grasp. We also threw a few more mind-bending facts into the mix. So this spread is about the bizarre consequences of relativity. The book tells you that if you stood it upright on a table, time would pass a tiny fraction of a second slower at the bottom of the page than the top, because it is closer to the Earth's center of gravity. And we wanted everything to be fully referenced. So this is the small print, which is a big appendix at the back of the book, where we explain all the background, all the calculations, and all the assumptions behind each spread. So I'll hand over to Stefanie now to explain how we visualize this data.
First, we put firm design rules into place from the beginning, the main one being no traditional charts or graphics allowed. We had an absolute ban on bar and line charts, axis labels, and so on, so none of the trappings of a traditional info book. Next, we made the rule that the book would only communicate its data using what we're calling its superpowers, its ink, pages, typeface, binding, and more. And we would use these to represent meaningful data in as many magical, clever, and witty ways we could think of. An example of how this might work could be seen where, well, for the English translation of the book at least, we use the double O's within relevant words to represent to scale the actual size of various animals' eyes in a spread that alludes to the decreasing letter size of the standard eye test. Another key part of the design is that it would be one where the physicality of the book was embraced and interaction was integral to understanding data concepts, where you might have to hold the book in the air, put it on the ground, drop it from waist height, snap it shut, wear it as a hat. This is not an ebook, and it never will be. And finally, we wanted the book to celebrate the power of print and the joy of typography by using lots of inky, full bleed color gradients, and also using our typeface not just to communicate text, but also as an illustrative device. So that's quite a brief we've created for ourselves. So how did we make it happen? Well, first we fixed the book's specifications, its dimensions, paper, cover finishes, number of pages. We fixed these with our publisher very early on, and they made blank dummy books to these specs that we could then work with while we developed the content. With this, we flipped the normal book production process on its head, since these decisions normally come later in the process or at the end. With this dummy in hand, we started by brainstorming all the ways of communicating data using its form, and these in effect were our visual variables. And we would test this material to its limits, carefully measuring and inspecting every component and interacting with it, bending the pages, wearing it as a hat while chatting to each other virtually. And we slowly started to find the beginnings of ideas.
To come up with ideas, we look for interesting measurements around the same size as the book, following our 1-to-1 scale rule. So for example, these could be lengths between 0.1 millimeter, that's the human egg-sized dot on the end of the arrow on the left, which you can't really see on here, and 20 centimeters, that's the height and width of the book, and it's the diameter of the grey circle on the right, which represents one giant single-celled organism. Then I researched the best of these ideas, and we built up the narrative spread by spread. So we pieced these spreads together, swapping them around and tweaking the copy and the designs until they made a coherent journey that was led by the book. Along the way, there was some drama, particularly over the book's weight. Because the facts we could include in the book were based on its measurements, we needed to come up with an estimate for its weight really quite early on that was reasonably accurate and allowed for some variation between copies, and round it to the nearest 10 grams. This 2-year saga involved weighing 2 versions of dummy books several times on kitchen scales in several different people's kitchens, and redoing the calculations at least twice before, for the published version of the book, finally settling on the same weight as our original estimate, which was 450 grams.
And so after doing all of this, here's the finished result in its final form with its CMYK gradient end papers and bright yellow cover board that you can see on the edges. And after these 2.5 years of hard work, from initial idea in a cafe to final publication, did we actually succeed in making a book that went beyond the usual info book? Well, the reviews are coming in from the best and brightest, and they're looking positive. As for the final printed weight of the book, well, the published weight of 450 grams isn't quite right, as on final weigh-in, our books average around 435 grams. The lesson here is that it's pointless trying to be too precise when working with variable materials, especially as book printers are actually allowed to be off by 1 to 2 mil when trimming and binding pages due to the imprecision of this mechanical process. And the ultimate win for us. The word data isn't anywhere in the book except for our bios on the second to last page where it couldn't be helped. So to sum this talk up, this book shows that even within mass market publishing, even using the traditional form of the book, even using non-digital methods, there is always scope to find completely new approaches to communicating data and information. So don't be afraid to test the boundaries of our field and experiment.
Rethinking the info book in this way also showed us that setting tight rules can push your practice in new directions. So our golden rule that everything should be on a 1-to-1 scale led us to explore ways of communicating quantities using physical interactions like wearing the book as a hat and using your tongue as a measuring device that have, at least as far as we know, not been attempted before. Finally, we believe there's value in storytelling to both children and adults, because wonder is a universal state of mind that people can tap into at every stage of life. So however jaded you might feel, there is always more to discover. And here is a final message from our book. It would like you to follow it on social media. So we're on Twitter and Instagram, and its website is linked above. It does like to talk back, so be prepared for some interaction if you follow it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
That was really lovely. Thank you so much, Stefanie and Miriam. I love the concept. I love the book. I love how you use sort of constraints and really sort of meditate on the physicality of it. We have some time for questions. So for everyone here, if you want to ask Stefanie or Miriam a question, please put it into the chat and I'll ask it for you. I'll use moderator's prerogative to ask the first one, which is, you mentioned a little bit of this, but what would be some of the more surprising facts about book publishing or physically how you assemble a book that you learned during this process that you didn't know before, or, you know, just a regular book reader might not be aware of? What are some fun book facts that you have for all of us?
I'll let Miriam, I'll let you take this one, because I have a past life as a book cover and book designer, so maybe. You're the newcomer.
Yeah, well, I have to say, I mean, pretty much everything about the book publication process was new to me. This is my first book when we started. So it was all new. I mean, I had to learn a lot of terminology for this book, like what is a cut flush board? Apparently, it's what we have in our book where you don't have any overlap between the pages and the cover. It doesn't extrude over the top. There's an example. I think this for me was the kind of the longest term project that I'd worked on. I'm used to working on things that have a much faster turnaround of days or weeks or perhaps months at most. So having a project that lasted over 2 years was a new thing for me. And yeah, it's difficult to say really what I discovered about publishing, because I discovered everything about publishing. So there isn't really anything that stands out. I guess I discovered that publishers don't like to use the internet as much as people and data viz. They like to have face-to-face phone calls, and like, yeah, COVID has kind of changed that, but that was a shock to me.
Cool.
Oh, I'll chime in and just say, I think this is the most like, yeah, I'm used to working in publishing, so I know the processes, but what I think has been really interesting with this book is that you would think that a book designer like myself would know all of the, like, I've never looked at a book in such detail or like really inspected it, or really like, we've spent so much time like asking questions about production, and Miriam's done so much research on where ink comes from and how the paper is made. And I just think I was continually surprised that there were like blind spots in my knowledge that I had never, there were a few things, I can't remember what they were, but I was like, I've never thought about this before. I don't think anyone in publishing has ever thought about this bit of the book. It's not a factor when you're designing it. And so we are there like trying to unpick it. So that was really interesting.
Yeah, like how much glue is used in binding and how the pages are bound, and yeah, all these kind of nitty-gritty details.
Cool. Catherine had a question, just wanting to find out a bit more about what the response has been like to the book so far.
Yeah, it's been really good. We've mainly been in touch with people in the data viz world, because that's where we both work, and the response has been really positive. We had a lovely review in the Financial Times, which was, yeah, great to see. But yeah, we're just hoping to get the book out there, and it's a very Christmas gifty book, so we're hoping that people will buy it for their children and family for Christmas.
We did, I think the only thing with this is that we're a little bit unlucky in that the book was published on Super Thursday, which had like 600 titles published because they all got pushed back because of COVID. So, so yeah, I think there's a lot of books knocking about, but yeah, it has been really positive, and I think we're really happy that those 2.5 years weren't in vain.
Cool. Sarah Grace had a question around whether you considered or thought about using different material other than paper for the book. Plastics, fabrics.
That's a good question. I'm not sure, did we? It's very hard to think. I don't think we did. I think at one point I suggested, why don't we have a massive hole in the cover? And you were like, no, let's not do that. That's too difficult. It's going to be really expensive.
Oh yeah, so I mean, it would be absolutely wonderful to use different materials. I mean, I think, you know, you've seen some of our past projects. Miriam and I are definitely keen in making things that are tactile of different materials and using sound or plastic or what have you. But I think what we were really constrained by was just production costs. There's a limit to how much like flair you can have on a cover, and how many like fancy finishes you're allowed, and how, you know, I was like, ooh, can I have additional ink besides CMYK? And they said no. So cost is a factor. Another thing that was a factor from the beginning as well is that because we had those dummies, they made sure that like things like the paper were paper stocks that were very easy to get more of, that it was like a really standard paper, so that way they could keep printing more and then the weight wouldn't change. So there had to be like a level of consistency because of that.
And also for foreign editions, you know, if we get a US book deal, they need to be able to get hold of the paper that's used.
Cool. We're coming up to half past, so last question from Isao. Do either of you have any ideas for digital displays or digital media that could play the same role as the constraints that you had for creativity? So if someone were to do a project and it wasn't a book, but it was something digital, like how might they approach the project with the same level of tight constraints for creativity that you guys took?
Maybe it's by setting yourself, I don't know. We set ourselves these rules that were really impossible in the beginning. Maybe it's just saying, I'm not going to do this, or I'm going to try to make something without relying on the thing that I always start with. You know, maybe that'll help. I mean, that'll help. But again, it all depends on how much time you have and the context. Miriam?
Yeah, I think the constraints that we had with this book were really unique to the book being the object that it is and the scale that it is, and they're very bound up with it being print. And we've had an interesting time thinking about which of the spreads work best on social media, because then you are translating them from print into something online, and many of them, of course, the ones to do with the weight of the book, when they don't really work, because you need to physically hold it in your hands, you need to feel it, and the volume of the book and the same. Things involving, I guess, yeah, not a lot works actually online. Things involving the time to read things, that we have a couple of spreads where there's one where you read a really long sentence and it takes you about 40 seconds to read it. And every time you get to the word now, something happens in the universe. So it follows, you know, all the energy that's being beamed down from the sun onto the earth, and then plants converting it by photosynthesis into sugar and oxygen, and then you breathe the oxygen in, and then you use that oxygen to read the sentence. So it kind of comes full circle. So it works. I also would work on radio and in audio, but most of the ideas are really specific to that way of telling the story in that medium.
Cool. Thank you very much. Thanks again for doing the talk, for being here.